Hi, my name is Lisa Wool-Rim Sjöblom. I'm a Swedish Korean comic book artist, illustrator, and adoptee rights activist. Most of my work focuses on transracial and transnational adoption and the challenges one faces as an Asian living in the West. In this video, I will talk a bit about my different books and projects and present how I work with matters of representation, racism, and decolonization. I'd like to thank Migration Memory Encounters for inviting me to participate, and before I dive in, I'd also like to express my support for the Black Lives Matter movement. For far too long, representation of East Asians in Sweden has consisted of either white entertainers in yellow face, or of racist stereotypes and caricatures depicting us as yellow-skinned, squinting people with rice hats, thick glasses, and buck teeth. My comics and illustrations bring attention to these racist tropes and criticize them. I also aim to broaden the general representation by drawing Asians in a neutral or positive light, as we also tend to be more or less invisible, even in conversations about people of color. The representation of adoption and adoptees has also been rather one-sided in Sweden. When adoptees are depicted in popular culture, we're usually ridiculed, where the joke is that we don't understand why we're different from everyone around us. A large portion of the literature concerning us is still written by adoptive parents and tend to reduce our adoptions to rainbow-painted, happy stories where trauma, loss and grief are nowhere to be seen. In my work, I aim for the other side of adoption and I approach the subject from a post-colonial, feminist and anti-racist point of view. In 2016, I published my first graphic novel, Palimpsest. It tells the story of the search for my Korean family and how I learned that not only was my adoption based on fraudulent information, there is also a large-scale billion-dollar industry that feeds on the separation of vulnerable family members and the movement of children, usually of color, from the global South and Asia to the political West. Palimpsest is about an adoptee who believed in everything that she'd been told about adoption, but comes out on the other side as an activist, fighting for justice for those whose rights have been denied them. My first international contribution was for a transatlantic annual called Strumpet. The issue's theme was origin stories, so I created a short comic called Paper Lives, in which I used different Korean symbols to address how the country systematically manipulated our background documents to turn us into orphans in order to make us adoptable. I wanted to highlight this to show how this practice has made it more or less impossible for so many of us to ever trace our roots. My second international small press publication was for the UK-based Zine, Daikon. They wanted migration stories and I contributed with the following piece. Alive, but somehow already departed. Migrated, but placed between the borders. I was told I was made out of airplane dust, that the airport was my place of birth. My name, lost in the wreckage left behind. We are uprooted social and biopolitical experiments planted in the West. What's left to care for after the slaughter of our families? Deterritorialized, renamed objects of desire, fulfilling the needs of white middle-class women, who build their colonial dreams with transnational myths, killing the Asian in me while saving the child. Now wearing my culture as a fashion statement, while my handbook rots away in a closet. Eating my grandmother's kimchi, but denying me a place at the table. Using my body to spread their colorblind fantasies while consuming almond eyes and skin of honey. Branding themselves citizens of the world while raising the borders to keep my ancestors out. They call it patriarchy when men force life from our mother's wombs. They call it sisterhood when they raise our mother's children as their own. White saviorism disguised as the rights of the child. Their feminism doesn't include my mother. Their freedom is built on her repression. By essentializing the East and trapping our people, cultures and languages in racist tropes, they spread their postmodern visions of a global motherhood. But what they don't know is that we are descended from tigers, and one day we will bite the hands that feed us. This is a short story I made for the Swedish feminist magazine Bang. The issue dealt with dystopian and utopian visions for the future, and since my adoption stories tend to be quite dark, this time I chose to depict a brighter future where international adoption has been abolished and adoptees and first families have been compensated for their losses. They've also been given official apologies and have had monuments raised in their honor to remind the world that this practice should be abolished forever. One of the larger projects I've committed to on my Instagram is the annual challenge Inktober. Every day I presented a topic or person that brought attention to various aspects of the darker side of adoption, such as corruption, bribery, murder, lies, suicide, separation of identical twins, destruction of records, activism, the orphan myth, coercion, silencing manufactured orphans, trafficking, baby boxes, trauma, rehoming, baby factories, sexual abuse, adopt-a-parent fragility, the pregnant adoptee, the adoption market, positive adoption language, deportation, more trafficking, another murder, the exhausted activist, academic research as activism, allies, adoptee networks, resistance, and adoptee solidarity. The following year, I used the talk I had given at the Swedish Gender Equality Agency in Gothenburg as a background for Inktober. The talk was split into two parts. The first dealt with corruption in the adoption industry, and I brought attention to the Convention on the Rights of the Child, the Hague Convention, guiding principles, problems with adoption as child protection, how adoption goes against children's rights, the orphan myth, corruption, non-acceptable reasons for adoption, manipulation of documents, adoption as the perfect crime, adoption from corrupt states, and finally, questioning the adoption industry. In the second part, I focused on transracially adopted girls and women from Asia and sexual abuse, like double oppression, sexual abuse of adopted Asians in Sweden, the Western story of the Asian woman, the Asian female body on the market, Myth Daikon. The image of the Asian woman as a prostitute. Sexual harassment in the workplace. Sexist yellow-face performances in Swedish entertainment. Abuse within the adoptive family. The consequences of racist, sexist abuse. And finally, how can we work towards a better future? The anthology Draw the Line was a response to the MeToo movement from a number of Swedish comic book artists who spoke up about sexual abuse and other closely related topics. My contribution dealt with the deeply problematic and disturbing hypersexualization of female Asian bodies in Sweden, including some personal experiences. In my comic, I also talked about strategies for dealing with racist sexism and how things are slowly moving forwards. We hear more and more Asian girls and women raise their voices in both protests and in solidarity. The latest thing I've been working on has been what's become a series of drawings that I post on my Instagram with the hashtag #IamNotAvirus. The posts draw attention to the rise in racist attacks on Asian people due to the spread of the coronavirus. I use it to inform my readers about the nature of the hate crimes and to show solidarity with victims around the globe. Finally, I want to talk about the challenging and often very lonely process of decolonizing myself, my writing and drawing. Like most transracial adoptees, I've been taught my whole life to consider myself white, to dismiss my Asianness and to look down on my first country. Before starting the work on Palimpsest, I had hardly ever even drawn a person of colour. Everyone I drew was always white. As a transracial adoptee, to start identifying with other people of colour is seen as a betrayal, as ingratitude and indeed hatred. By disassociating ourselves with whiteness, we're letting down those who have saved us and given us a better life. To let go of those change is not easy, especially since the process is quite often made even more difficult with the underlying separation trauma. For an adoptee, this can be particularly difficult since we usually don't have anything to fall back on as well. We need to relearn our whole existence. But I find that to start the process of decolonizing ourselves is both liberating and rewarding, and it brings us to a place where we can exist on our own terms. And what we say, draw, and write about stops being conditioned by white fragility. This is a place where we can be seen for the people we are and not the people the adoption industry wishes to hide. Please check out my Instagram if you want to see more of my work and activism. If you want, you can support me by becoming my Patreon, and please feel free to get in touch with me if you have any questions or want to know more about the things I've been talking about. Thank you so much for listening.